All right, so this is the last of the three topics that we'll talk about in human development. And again, we're looking at this summary chart, even though you have more detailed slides to look at on your own. And really, there's really only one main concept that we're going to talk about in social development, and that is about how we develop our ability to relate to other people. And the beginning of that story is going to happen at birth, right? And so I want you to think about what our very first relationships are. And those are our primary caregivers. For many people, for most people, that's mom and dad, or at least mom or dad. But it doesn't have to be, and it doesn't matter if you're biologically related to the person who's your caregiver, as long as you have a caregiver. And over the first 2 years of life, we have this very, very important task of developing attachment. And the slides talk a little bit in more detail about how that happens. It's not automatic. It relies on the caregiver providing sensitive responsiveness, which is being sensitive to the child's needs and then being willing to respond to the child's needs. And so that sensitive responsiveness is really fundamental to the development of attachment. And in fact, children who don't have somebody providing sensitive responsiveness don't develop attachments, and in fact might wind up with an attachment disorder. And then even if a parent supplies sensitive responsiveness, they do that in incomplete or problematic ways or inconsistent ways. We may not get as healthy an attachment. We call healthy attachment secure attachment, and that is what most children develop. That is the rule, and then there's exceptions to the rule. So secure attachment is what we're hoping for. It's what we're mostly going to talk about here in terms of outcomes. But parents who are only sometimes available, or who sometimes are supportive and other times dismissive, might lead to attachment that is insecure in one of several ways. We're not going to go into that in great detail here in just this overview. If you take a human development or a child development course, you'll go into that in much more detail. Um, so we hope that we get attachment by age 2, and I want you to pay attention to that age 2 as the cutoff, because that should echo very closely what we talked about in physical development, which is that first drop in brain elasticity. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those two things correspond, but when we get that first drop in brain elasticity, we also seem then to end most of our ability to form attachment relationships. And so children who don't have that opportunity by the time they're 2 are going to then have that drop in brain elasticity and likely not be capable of developing real attachments to anyone throughout their life. Now, obviously, it's not that there's a window that slams shut on that on their second birthday. These are estimates, right? But it's around that age. And attachment disorders basically look like somebody who will talk to other people and interact with other people, and maybe even choose other people to be their friends or to be their spouses or partners, etc. But the reality is that they don't experience attachment. So, typical attachment can be detected in 2 fairly reliable ways. So that when we're attached to somebody else, we show efforts to maintain contact and distress upon separation. And somebody with an attachment disorder, in fact, might not make great efforts to maintain contact. And when they're separated from the person that they identify as their partner or their friend, they don't seem particularly troubled by that, and may walk away from relationships fairly easily without any experience of distress. And that efforts to maintain contact and distress upon separation is going to be the hallmark of attachment relationships throughout our life. So it's easy to see that in infancy and early childhood, right? So if you take the 2 or 3-year-old who is separated from their parents, so imagine them at the mall and they get separated, the child's going to be very distressed and the parent's going to be very distressed because that's that distress at separation. And efforts to maintain contact are easy to see if a child, for example, is playing at a playground. They're going to run back and forth just to kind of touch base with the parents. And in fact, the parent will also every once in a while get up and look around and make sure that they can see the child and maybe even go over to the child, right? Efforts to maintain contact. And through the school years, we see that children who have healthy attachments have better peer relationships, in part because they can bring that attachment style that they have into those new relationships. And they also have better academic performance, in part because they feel competent and confident, but also in part because they can interact with teachers in productive ways for the same attachment reason. And even though we have this idea that adolescence is the time of detachment, it's not. That for families that have a healthy attachment style, for a child who has a secure attachment to their parents going into adolescence, there might be a little bit more fighting while there's negotiation about individuation and identity development. But in fact, that secure attachment continues into adolescence, and we see strong parent-child relationships. And still efforts to maintain contact and distress at separation that will look very different than it did in the school years and in the early childhood years, but still there. And we see really much better outcomes for securely attached infants. They have less drug use, they have later first sex, then less vulnerable to peer pressure, and all of that is about the fact that they approach relationships in different ways. And in fact have these very stable relationships at home, but then also bring that into the new relationships they're forming. And so even into adulthood, we see secure attachment that leads to, right, that it leads to affects the choices we make in adult relationships. We tend to have healthier adult relationships if we have secure attachment. We parent better because we have secure attachment, and then use that secure attachment to attach to our own children. And people with healthy attachment are more successful in their careers and therefore have a better financial outlook and also have better physical health. And that continues into old age. That as we age, we live longer and have better health overall if we have secure attachment, but also we tend to maintain better social networks as we age, in part because we just work at the relationships we have and make efforts to maintain them, but also that as we lose those to friends who move or in fact die, that we also are better able to make new social connections, and so in that way we wind up with a better social network throughout life. And so secure attachment is really important to lots of outcomes. It's one of the most important things that has to happen in early childhood and infancy, in fact, and to predict good outcome for life. And so the other thing that we pay attention to in adolescence is that this is a time of changing social relationships, right? And so adolescents do widen their social relationships with more time away from the family, but that's not the same as diminishing their relationships with family. And that's a really important point that I want you all to pay attention to. And then we also have this major task of adolescence, which is identity development, where you explore your sense of self and what roles you're going to take on, what social roles you're going to take on. And that is where we do sometimes get some pushing up against parents, some more conflict with parents, as parents might object to certain identities that the adolescent tries on. And if you're an adolescent or a young adult, right, the part of your job is simply to try on identities for size and then discard them when they don't fit. And both things are important, the willingness to try on and the willingness to discard if it doesn't fit. And to, and good outcome here depends on living in part and living with a family that allows you to do that to some degree, as opposed to you having to take an identity that they expect you to adopt, which is a less healthy outcome here. And so again, this is an area where in a human development course or child development course we'll go into in much more detail, but this is just an overview of what social development looks like. This is really a good segue as we end this chapter here, because our next chapter is social psychology, where we talk a lot about how we relate to other people, and so in some ways we'll come back to some of these same concepts.